everyone. Can you all hear me all right? Good. My name is Noreen Tomasi, and I'm the director of the Center for Fiction. Before I begin with the panel, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we'll soon be opening our new facility in Brooklyn in the beginning of 2019. And to tell you a little bit about that, it will have 18,000 square feet of space over 3 floors for people who love books, including a state-of-the-art auditorium, bookshop, library, reading rooms, meeting places, writer's studio, terraces where you can get a drink, because that's very important, and lots of programs. We're catty-corner from the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and our neighbors are Mark Morris Dance Group, and just behind us, Theater for a New Audience, if that helps you to locate where we will be. It's an exciting, very exciting time to move to that cultural district where so much is happening. We are already part of the Downtown Brooklyn Arts Alliance, which includes, I believe now, over 40 organizations making art, supporting artists, and serving audiences in the downtown Brooklyn area, which includes the BAM Cultural District. So we see lots of opportunity for partnerships and cross-disciplinary work in our beautiful new auditorium. So I hope you'll all come visit us there and become a part of the family we're building in Brooklyn. So thank you for that. Before we talk about the panel, there are some things I need to say on behalf of the Brooklyn Book Festival. And the first is huge thanks to the organizers of this festival. It is one of the most amazing literary events I've been to, so I hope you all agree. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased from the wonderful Greenlight Bookstore out on the plaza. The authors will also be signing their books immediately following this program at the signing tables downstairs in the rotunda. Authors, at the conclusion of the program, please go directly to your signing tables. I have to say that. And audience, please clear the room for the next event at the end of the program. I think these events are scheduled very tightly. Thank you all for coming out on this absolutely beautiful fall day to talk about grief and loss. I do want to say that in each of these extraordinary books, you'll find, as you read them or as you have read them, that sadness is only one part of grieving. It can be and often is absurd and darkly humorous as well. And as William Faulkner said, between grief and nothing, I will take grief. Each of these extraordinary writers has written memoirs about the deaths of those closest to them, a husband, a wife, a mother. And through their stories, we understand their own sense of loss, but also the way that we deal with death in this society and the way that the loss of a loved one begins to affect all things in one's life. Private collections. He is the recipient of 2 National Endowment for the Arts grants and serves on the board of YADO, the oldest arts community in the United States. Recently, Sandrof created It Occurs to Me That I Am America, a collection of writing and art with more than 50 contributors to benefit the ACLU. His memoir, The Widower's Notebook, was published by Penguin Books in July. You can also hear a podcast that I did with Jonathan on our podcast series, Fiction Talks. You can download the podcast series, or you can go to our website at www.centerforfiction.org to hear that. Joyce Carol Oates is the recipient Is there anyone here who doesn't know Joyce Carol Oates? I will read this anyway. Joyce is the recipient of National Medal of the Humanities, the National Book Critics Circle, Ivan Sandrof Lifetime Achievement Award, the National Book Award, the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Fiction, and has been several times nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. She has written some of the most enduring fiction of our time, including national bestsellers We Were the Mulvaneys, Blonde, which was nominated for the National Book Award, and the New York Times bestseller The Falls, which won the 2005 Prix Femina. She is the Roger S. Berlin Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Princeton University and has been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters since 1978. She is the author of the memoir, A Widow's Story. Megan O'Rourke, immediately to my left, began her career as one of the youngest editors in the history of The New Yorker. Since then, she has served as cultural editor and literary critic for Slate, as well as poetry editor and advisory editor for the Paris Review. Her essays, criticism, and poems have appeared in Slate, New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, New York Times Book Review, The Nation, etc., etc., etc. Her poetry collections include Once, 2011, and Half-Light, 2007. She was awarded the inaugural May Sarton Poetry Prize, the Union League Prize for Poetry, from the Poetry Foundation, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, etc., etc. A graduate of Yale University, she has taught at Princeton, the New School, and New York University. She is currently working on a book about chronic illness. She lives in Brooklyn, yay, and where she grew up in Marfa, Texas, and she'll be talking today about The Long Goodbye, which is a memoir about the death of her mother. We'll begin today with short readings by each of the writers, and Megan will begin, and then Jonathan, and then Joyce. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming out, as Noreen said, on this beautiful day to talk about loss. It's funny how loss and beauty can be flip sides of the same coin. I'm just going to read from a section. So my book is a kind of hybrid memoir and work of cultural criticism in which I try to make some claims about what I saw as the problems with grieving today in America and the West more broadly, namely that we're really bad at it. We're really bad at supporting one another in it, let me say. So some of the book looks at the science and thinking around grief, and some of it is memoir. And I'm going to read from a section about my mother being in the hospital. She died at 55 in Connecticut at home. She was an educator. Actually, she was a lower school teacher at St. Anne's here and ended up being a principal of the middle school while I was in it. Anyway, so I'll read a few pages. One of the ideas I've clung to most of my life is that if I just try hard enough, it will work out. If I work hard, I'll be spared, and I will get what I desire, finding the cave opening over and over again, thieving life from the abyss. This sturdy belief system has a sidecar in which superstition rides. Until recently, I half believed that if a certain song came on the radio just as I thought of it, it meant that all would be okay. What did I mean? I preferred not to answer that question. To look too closely was to prick the balloon of possibility. I also held the delusion that the imperfect could be fixed by attention. And so in the hospital, I was always eager to show the nurses what I knew, how much I had learned, including the fact that I had to prostrate myself before their wisdom, experience, and sore feet. I was the model relative, slipping out along the linoleum hallway in my thick stay-over socks, delicately catching the attention of the receptionist and saying, "I see that my mother's morphine is about to run out. I wonder if someone could change it before it starts beeping and wakes her. I know," leaning in confidingly, like a student bowing her head to a good teacher, "that we need to stay ahead of the pain." I would pause a beat. "I know you're all so busy, I just don't want my mother," a slight stress on the word, another pause, almost imperceptible, so that the nurse could think, my mother, and remember her own mother, who perhaps had cradled her and nursed her, the only relationship like that we have, mysterious, impenetrable, luxurious. To suffer, and I'd exhale. And the strapped receptionist wouldn't smile, but she would say, "I'll try to signal the floor nurse for you, honey." Doctors and nurses are the family members' priests. We supplicate them, please let us go, just let us go home. We recite their catechism. We assure them we will not blame them. We just want her to be at home. We will not sue you. These nurses were our benefactors. They were the ones who did all the work. The doctors knew things but had to get on. The nurses administered the morphine. They adjusted the bed. They washed my mother and helped her take a shower. They were a sorority, eager, optimistic, burned out. I liked the receptionist. She was tough, and she saw through my wheedling show, but she helped me anyway because she understood that underneath the performance lay not manipulation, but desperation. In these moments, sliding back to my mother's room, past the room of another woman dying of cancer, whose daughter, about my age, much taller, elegant, and thin, showed up regularly with her 2 young children, and who caused in me a flicker of envy, a whiff of the perennial outsider, so that even here, even now, where I knew we were facing the real deal, I would experience the exact same twinge I used to feel in 8th grade at the sight of a peer who was put together and clean-limbed in all the ways I never felt. Your grief is not like mine, I thought spitefully. And in this perverse manner, I somehow believed, and still do, sitting here with my books and my words, that I could lift the window in that dim, grimy Bridgeport hospital room and take my mother's bony hand and slip out into the street, past the hospital awning, into the royal purple evening. And then the noises would return. I could hear the coughing man whose family talked about sports and sitcoms every time they visited, sitting politely around his bed. And as they left, they would hug him and say, "We love you, and we'll be back soon." And in their voices, and in mine, and in the nurse who was so gentle with my mother, tucking cool white sheets over her with a twist of her wrist, I could hear love, love that sounded like a rope. And I began to see a flickering electric current everywhere I looked as I went up and down the halls, flagging nurses, little flecks of light dotting the air in sinewy lines, and I leaned on these lines like guy ropes when I was so tired I couldn't walk anymore, and a voice in my head said, "Do you see this, love, and do you still not believe?" Now I think that was exhaustion. But at the time, the love, it was like ropes around me that could carry us up into the higher floors away from our predicament and out onto the roof and across the empty spaces above the hospital to the sky. Of course, this didn't happen. I got the nurse, and she replaced the morphine bag. And then my mother shuffled over to the couch with her IV pole, and we curled up, and I pulled out my laptop and scooted close to her, and we watched an episode of some show on DVD. Periodically, the computer would freeze, and we'd shake it. I tried to sleep on the pull-out couch, but its plastic mattress was noisy. Machines beeped all around me in the antiseptic hallways. Every now and then my mother moaned. I got up to give her a jolt of morphine. Outside the window lay Bridgeport Harbor, one of the least picturesque pieces of waterfront on the northeast seaboard. The city lights were a peculiar wan orange. The room in which my mother lay was functional, scattered with coyly folding plastic tables, buttons for reclining and inclining, and wee tubes of toothpaste. You won't be needing much. Beyond the window, a Metro North train pulled into the station and paused. The timing was so familiar from my trips on the train to see my parents that I imagined I could hear the ding signaling the doors about to close and the gravelly voice announcing this was the train to New Haven. I could see the small outlines of figures within, like characters in a story, perhaps, a Cheever story, perhaps, going home to their flawed homes, the only homes we have on this planet, the train swinging smoothly along the tracks, lit up and shiny, silhouettes bending over their magazines and computers, pressing onward into the night. In the morning, when she woke, she said to me, "Can you take me home, honey? I think if I go home, I'll feel better. I'll be able to straighten my throat." She gestured to it. "It needs to uncrinkle. Last night I dreamed that you were all in the living room with me at home, and you all were sitting in the chairs very straight, and I couldn't do it, and I was very frustrated. And you told me if I just moved chairs, I'd be able to sit straight like the rest of you. And I wanted to, but I couldn't get out of my chair."
Thanks so much, Megan.
Thank you, Noreen and the Center for Fiction for putting this together. And it's both an honor and interesting for me to be sitting with these 2 women because For a year after my wife died very suddenly, I couldn't read at all. And then when I started reading, the books I read were all memoirs of a certain genre, and one of them was Megan's book, one of them was Joyce's book. And I ended up reading about 60 of those books. You may think that sounds really morbid, but I found a kind of hope and not feeling alone by reading those books. They really helped me. So what I decided this morning when I was going through my book was that I would spare you. I'd read 2 short parts, but I would read a part that people tend to find funny because my book's broken into, excuse me, chapters, and so I'm going to read a part of a chapter called Stupid Things Said by Smart People. So this is what I should tell you is also I kept notebooks for 2 years, and I would write down at night everything that I had done during the day and all the conversations I would have with people because I felt out of my mind, and it somehow grounded me I had never journaled, and so when I put the book together, in a certain way, it was not that difficult because I had all of this information and I just had to pick and choose. Anyhow, this is not a very serious chapter, though I think it has serious ramifications. I'm in a Chelsea restaurant, a neighborhood place, seated in a booth. Across from me is a couple I've known for many, many years. It's a second marriage for both, now married 20-plus years and devoted to each other. So far, the evening has been pleasant and distracting. These are 2 funny, smart, and accomplished people. Midway through dinner, I tell them that a friend in common, one they know much better than I, has been insistent in trying to fix me up with their friend. It turns out they know the friend's friend. The wife says, by the way, they're just identified as the husband and the wife. The wife says she's pretty. The husband says she's sexy. I say I'm not ready to date. The wife waves a dismissive hand. Oh, please, she says. In a few months, you'll be dating her or fucking someone else for sure. She laughs. I do not. I'm rather surprised by her statement, not for any prudish reason, but for her rather dismissive, insensitive response. In the past, I would have made a joke. Now I simply say, I don't think so. She leans toward me and she says, oh, fine, and that does it. Now I lean toward her and very quietly but seriously I say, I want you to imagine that, and I name her husband who's sitting beside her, has died and it is 4 months later. Will you be dating or fucking someone else for sure? I surprise myself. I'm not one for confrontation. She glares at me, lips pursed, a moment of poisonous silence. I file her comment under stupid things said by smart people. There were many, but I wonder, are widows, only months after their husbands have died, told they will be fucking someone else for sure? I think not, though perhaps they'd like the option. With men, it seems, everyone is telling you to go out and get laid, though I suspect that when you do, people will talk about you, and not in a nice way. The husband finally breaks the silence by saying he has no intention of dying. Over dessert... I didn't think that was a funny line. Over dessert, the wife attempts an apology. It was a compliment, she says. I mean, you're a catch. You're good-looking and women like you, and there are a shortage of men, you know, decent men, and I'm sure Joy, that was my wife, wouldn't expect you to be celibate. I tell her I don't intend to be, but that it's too early for me to be dating. Then she does it again. She waves that dismissive hand and laughs. Oh, please, she says, I'm sure you will be remarried in no time. I give her a look. She says, sorry, I just don't see you being unattached for a while. For very long. On the other hand, her husband chimes in, why not play the field? There are plenty of single women. You might as well have fun. His wife glares at him. That's not what I'm suggesting. Why shouldn't he have fun? He should, she says, but I think he's the marrying kind. It's obvious, isn't it? He was married for 40 years. I know, says the husband, which is why I think he should play around for a while. Play around, the wife gives her husband the same pursed-lipped look she gave me. I just think it would be good for him, the husband says. Oh, really, says the wife. Maybe that's what you want. People usually suggest things they want for themselves. She bangs her cup down on the table so hard, coffee sloshes over the rim. I was just suggesting it for Johnny, the husband says. Let's just forget it, the wife says. Fine, the husband says. Fine, the wife says. A full minute of silence. This time it falls to me to break the ice. I'm sure he was thinking of me, I say to the wife about her husband. But why am I trying to fix their fight? Because I cannot stand an angry silence, because I always want everything to be okay. The wife turns to me and says, well, I hope you do play around and fuck 100 women and tell my husband all about it so he can get the vicarious thrills he's obviously missing with me. This is verbatim because I wrote it directly after in my notebook. Jesus, the husband says, a perverse part of me is starting to enjoy this. That my situation, the sudden death of my wife, the possibility of my future relationships, the possibility of me fucking 100 women has them fighting. The wife turns to me again. Do anything you want. I mean it. Anything. Have affairs, travel the world. Perhaps it's she who wants the fantasy of affairs and travel, but I don't dare say so. Later, when I write about this in my notebook, it offers some insight into why newly single men and women are not always welcomed by couples. Because they can stir something up, because they represent a theoretical threat. The idea that the newly single can do anything they want, something that some couples obviously feel they cannot, something that threatens the very basic notion of coupledom. Did I ever feel this way? Well, sure. There were plenty of times I wanted total freedom, not just the freedom my wife Joy gave me, which was a lot. But I've learned something. I've learned that this theoretical freedom is pretty much a fantasy, and I've learned something else. Freedom can be lonely. So I have one other little piece to read to you that is not quite as humorous. So this is, I'm just going to skip a big part of this. It's from a chapter called Going On, and it begins like this. Do we overcome grief? The answer for me is not really. Grief is a permanent scar, part of who I am now and who I always will be. There are certain things we're not meant to get over, and the loss of our nearest and dearest is, I believe, in that category. But it does not mean it has to kill you, at least not yet. Here's a contradiction that took me a long time to figure out. I desperately wanted to get past my grief, but I also subconsciously dreaded it, because getting past it might mean that all the reminders of joy and of our life together would recede or possibly even disappear, and I didn't want that to happen. So I'm just skipping to one more short piece. I'm writing in my notebook late at night. It's warm, and I have my studio windows open, a soggy breeze wafting in, carrying with it distant sirens and horns, nighttime sounds of the city, and music. A party happening somewhere in the warren of big and small buildings behind mine. For hours, it's been rap and hip-hop. Now it's a golden oldie, Dion on the Belmonts, a teenager in love. Joy and I had been dating only a month when we went to a party at a Boston club where a friend of mine was the DJ. He was a doo-wop and Motown freak, the Del Vikings, the Five Satins, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Marvin Gaye. Joy and I arrived just as this Dion classic was booming through the speakers. Joy asked me if I knew how to do the Lindy, and I did because my sister had taught me. We'd grown up watching American Bandstand, had studied the way those Philly kids danced, knew all the moves, and Joy did too. I led, Joy followed, perfectly. It was as if we had been dancing for years. Within minutes, there was a circle around us, cheering us on. No one danced like that back then, partnered together, so we were a novelty. And when the song changed to Baby Love, we slowed down the same moves, and that was it. The night we fell in love. We could always impress a crowd with our Lindy skills, but it was never about anyone else, just about us, the way Joy anticipated my moves and I anticipated hers. I don't know about anyone else, but to me, dancing and sex are close relatives, and I think it's a damn shame that so many men don't dance because they don't know what they're missing. Over the many years we were married, there were times at home, in the kitchen, or living room when a great song would come on the radio, and I'd grab hold of Joy, and we'd dance, and we'd fall in love all over again. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. It's so touching to sit here and listen to these beautifully written compositions. My memoir is a little different from, I think, most memoirs in that it was written in the present tense. It was basically an assemblage of journal entries. So there's a certain breathlessness about it. The first several months after a loss, we are in some state of mental agitation and indefinition, almost in an odd way without any emotion. It's almost as if we're neutral and as a kind of wind has blasted us clean, and it's hard to define that. So most of my memoir is about that state. That lasted for me about 3 months. And then after 6 months, my insomnia went away. So it was like a physiological phenomenon. So when I look back at my memoir, it's really like a person who'd been living in a very intense situation, but that's now past. So I will read, well, I think that I don't think I'm up to reading about the actual experience. So I'm going to read a couple of pieces that are more universal or transcendent. Because I never know when I might suddenly break down, but this is sort of, quote, poetic. And I think you could all identify with this. One is called memory pools, and the other is called sinkholes. So if you've suffered a loss, you know what each of them is, you perhaps experienced them. Memory pools. Forever after you will recognize those places which are previously invisible and indiscernible, where memory pools accumulate. All waiting areas of hospitals, hospital rooms, and in particular those regions of the hospital reserved for the very ill, telemetry, intensive care. You will not wish to return to those places where memory pools lie underfoot treacherous as acid. In the corners of such places, in the shadows, in stairwells, in elevators, in corridors and restrooms, you have memorized without your knowing. In the hospital gift shop, at the newsstand, where you linger staring at news headlines already passing into oblivion, even as you peruse them. While upstairs in your sick husband's hospital room, an attendant is changing bedclothes or bathing the patient behind a screen. Unless the patient has been taken to radiology for further x-rays, shivering and awaiting his turn in another corridor. Memory pools accumulate beneath chairs in waiting areas adjacent to telemetry. Maybe that actual tears have stained the tile floors or soaked into the carpets. It may be that these tears can never be removed. And everywhere the odor of melancholy, that is the very odor of memory. Nowhere in a hospital can you walk without blundering into the memory pools of strangers, their dread of what was imminent in their lives, their false hopes, the wild elation of their hopes, the sudden, terrible, and irrefutable knowledge. You would not wish to hear echoes of their whispered exchanges. But he was looking so well yesterday. What happened to him overnight? You would not wish to blunder into another's sorrow. You will have all that you can do to resist your own. And, well, maybe I'll read some of the advice, which is what Johnny was just reading. And it's not really that a widow or widower doesn't want people to say something to us. It's just that it's hard to know what to say on both sides. And so these things come out awkwardly. who knows what that couple was, the woman was really thinking something deeper. She didn't want to burst into tears, so she took it on this sort of almost Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf level, you know, it just, and then once you get started in that kind of dialogue, it's like a ping pong game, you know, and you keep outdoing yourself. But I did also, I was quite struck by the things that people say. Some of them I thought were quite beautiful. So in the very beginning of my book, I have some of these remarks, which are almost like poetry. The first one is from Gail Godwin, a writer friend. She said, this is what she said: "Oh God, you are going to be so unhappy." She left that as a message, and it always stayed with me. I've thought about it so much. It is apt, because she had lost her husband a few years before. It's absolutely raw and true, and one widow to another, and forget about all the other stuff. You're going to be so unhappy. Just get ready. So I put that's a number one that's in the book, because it's absolutely unmitigated, and it's so true. It's much more true than saying, oh, you'll get over it and get married and all this. Then this quote is from Derek Parfit, the distinguished philosopher. He was a British philosopher who died, I think, about a year ago. I did not know Derek Parfit very well, but I had met him a few times. He was a friend of people in the Princeton philosophy department. He says, "I am very sorry to learn that Ray died a couple of weeks ago. When someone I loved died, I found it helpful to remind myself that this person was not less real because she wasn't real now, just as people in New Zealand aren't less real because they aren't real here." And I should say that Derek Parfit is a saintly person and a great classic. He's one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. He had a distinguished white hair. He was tall. He was very, very well-spoken. And I read this over endlessly. And I wanted to scream at him, and I said, yes, but people in New Zealand are alive, and you could meet them. You could fly over there and meet them. You could touch them. But when people are deceased, they are not any longer in the world, and I think that ontological disruption is violent and irrevocable, and you can't talk out your way out of it. Then here's another interesting comment. A poet named Tom Dillon, who's a Canadian poet, quote, "When my mother died, I adopted the Gestalt technique of saying to myself, whenever there was a surge of grief, I choose to have a mother who is dead." And that's another interesting vantage point, that the person isn't in New Zealand, but you've chosen deliberately that you have a mother who's dead. I think I know what he's getting at. You're sort of trying to take control of something about which you have no control at all. It's the delusion of ego mastery over something that is completely out of your control. I choose to have, and just fill it in, you know. I choose to be a complete failure. I choose to have broken my arm, you know. That's the Gestalt technique. I think Gestalt had its peak in the 1960s and may have gone downhill since then. But then one of the most beautiful comments, which I thought about all the time, is from my friend Gloria Vanderbilt, who had suffered many losses, including the suicide of her son not too many more years before. Quote, "One breath at a time, Joyce, one breath at a time." That, along with Gail Godwin's remarks, I think are just about all you need to know. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much. For this section, I'll ask a few questions, but I hope you'll also have questions of each other, and we'll ask each other questions. Then we'll open it to a few questions from the audience. I wanted to begin with this very strange quote from C.S. Lewis, because I know that you've all read C.S. Lewis's book on grief and the loss of his wife. And it says, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear." And I wonder what you think about that quote and if it resonates for you at all. Jonathan?
Oh, I knew that was happening. You know, I read that book. I read C.S. Lewis's book, and I do recommend it. But I read it after my book, and I was glad. I don't necessarily, unless you were to describe fear as sort of curling up outside of the world, I'm not. I mean, I think, you know, I talk about it, I try and define grief in my book by saying that, you know, all the cliches we have about grief and, you know, what it's going to be like, that they're all true, but they don't have any meaning until we, you know, go through them. Maybe it's, I don't know. I mean, I was so busy sort of perfecting a mask of being totally normal that I don't know that I allowed much fear into the idea of grief, or even grief. It took me a long time to face the idea of grief. So maybe I'm going to turn it over to Joyce or Megan to answer that.
Well, I'm not even sure that we know what grief exactly is. If one of your arms had been torn off and something was just profoundly missing from your very being, it's almost too intimate for a word like grief. It's sort of part of your own identity, a part of your own self. So fear is the anticipation of something happening in the future, but the grief is really looking to the past and something's been lost that's almost indefinable. I felt that soon after my husband died, that I was on something like a treadmill, and that I was very, very breathless and panicky. Even though the worst thing had already happened, it seemed to me something else was going to happen. And I very much had a strong predilection that made me think that I should not still be alive. I felt guilty and confused. And the first thing I did was I cleaned out my own closet and threw out some very beautiful clothes that my mother had sewed for me. I remember throwing these things out thinking I don't need them anymore. And I was really angry at myself, and I felt quite self-loathing and fury, a sort of furiousness. But maybe that was blocking a more somber and more mature kind of grief, because the way I was behaving was more childlike or primitive, that I was sort of maiming or hurting myself, and then I found it very hard to sleep. And so it was like things were being absorbed in me. So when Gloria Vanderbilt says, one breath at a time, that's a rejoinder against panic attacks and trying to do everything at once, just one breath at a time, the 1 hour, and one day at a time, and one thing at a time. And, you know, you basically calm down, settle down. So grief is just so complex, and it's physiological too, because you can't really eat too well. So one of the best things that a friend did, this is Jean Corlitz, the novelist, who's the wife of Paul Muldoon. I always remember the nice things people did. She said, you won't be able to eat anything, so I'm going to leave this for you. So she left these smoothies, I think Odwalla, about 6 of them. So I put them in the refrigerator, and that's what sort of kept me going, because I wasn't able to eat. Something very practical like that, because the grief is physiological.
Yeah, I think that line, I mean, that book, C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, was written as he was grieving, right? As Joyce's was, as mine was, as really yours was too, which is really an interesting formal thing to think about, that we all wrote books not in reflection, but as we were grieving. I think that was very important to my project because I felt like all the memoirs I had read of grief, Joyce's wasn't out yet, had a falseness to them because they were written in recollection when one's grief is different, right? Grief is not a stable thing. So I think what Lewis is getting at there, which both of you have gotten at, is that grief is so somatic in those early days. It's so bodily, like fear. I didn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I had anxiety. It felt to me as if the wind had whipped my skin raw, right? And so that I think that's part of what he's trying to remind us of. I think one thinks it's going to be this just sadness. It's a kind of abstract emotion that we feel, but it's like being under the ocean in the way that fear is. We know that that's a deeply physical, visceral response.
Can I just say that it's absolutely true, and I didn't expect that tremendous physical response, but I also wanted to say something that Joyce said, which was that I did, at a certain point, I said, I don't have to have any fear because the worst thing has already happened, so now I don't have to worry about anything ever again. And that literally lasted like a day because it flipped around so that then I worried about everything to a point that was really quite insane, so, but I don't think you can quite control those things, so.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, the reaction that I had that was more intellectual was just profound and all pervasive. The terrible melancholia and the cynicism and nihilism of Hamlet before Hamlet goes into action, when he's so steeped in the melancholy of the world. I sort of looked around me and I just realized, it's like epiphany, that's only because we had these little bubbles of affection and love and tenderness, like our parents who loved us and without any qualification, and a spouse. And that just shielded us from that blunt reality that Hamlet and other tragic figures of Shakespeare are looking into, that basically the world is without any meaning. And of course you're going to die. Why are you surprised that your husband has died? You're all going to die. Everybody's husband's going to die. These thoughts just came to me, and I realized that I had been actually deceived before. And it was this loss that catapulted me into a higher level of perception that was much more in line with what the universe really is.
It's funny to think about, but I feel like it actually, people would say to me, how did you write a book? And I actually found it quite easy to write in that state of heightened perception because I felt when I had the energy, but I did feel that, a certain deception had been stripped from me. Maybe the fear comes from, I do remember along with that feeling that I sometimes would think my foot could go through the sidewalk, right? I would have these strange physical, if this could disappear, everything could disappear. Of course, that's not quite how it works. But just to think about too, that grief, for me, time changed so much in grief, and that is one of the interesting things about writing books that come out of recording in the moment what is happening to you, as I was doing, or writing journals and then returning to them. That the time, one of the things about grief is that you're living in the past and you're imagining a future you can't imagine, and the present is so heightened in a kind of time travel way that other people maybe aren't living as intensely all the time. I don't know if you found that to be true.
As Joyce says that you also did. I'm sorry. Did you want to just the fact that you I think it's quite common that you can't sleep at all, so that your day gets stretched and blurred and a fugue state that you're in. Noreen, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say that they're signaling me from the back that we have only 5 minutes, which means that I know.
That's because we read too much.
Which means that we have time maybe only for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and so would you like to ask 1 or 2 questions? Would that be okay?
Sure.
And no statements of any kind, just quick questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. My question is about making art from suffering. I'm wondering, I help people write their memoirs, and one of the things that happens when people are talking about trauma is sometimes they will re-experience the trauma. And I'm wondering how you navigated, negotiated that experience.
I definitely was re-experienced, or I wrote it, in the weeks, days, months after my mother died. so I was experiencing the trauma all the time anyway. My experience of grief was one of re-experiencing the trauma. My mother died after a long illness in which she suffered a fair amount. One of the weird things people said to me, by the way, was a friend of mine said, which do you think was better? Would have been better, that she died after a long time or if she'd had a quick death? And I said, well, I didn't get to choose and I don't know what the other one was like. So
That's terrible.
she was like, maybe this was better. You got to say goodbye. So I don't know how to answer that question except insofar as to say it actually helped me, almost like saying Kaddish might be helpful, that sort of externalization was useful.
Well, I think that there is no remedy but that you just have to relive it. And you have to relive it and make of it some sort of formal and coherent work of art and just keep doing it over and over again. And finally, maybe you will have some apprehension of it that's not just emotional, but you've sort of transmuted it into language.
I will say, though, that because I couldn't speak about what had happened, the writing did help me. People ask me if it was cathartic, and I will say no, because it was the most painful thing I ever did. But on the other hand, I realized now, after traveling around with this book and getting emails from strangers every day, that I'm glad I did that. The other thing is that I think when you write these things down, they become real in a different way. And I also think it's very natural for artists and writers to do that. It's like, I felt guilty, like how can I possibly be writing about this? And thinking about my sentence structure. But in fact, you do, that's what you do, And because also I did drawings, there are drawings in my book, I had to hide all the photographs, but it was a way of staying close because drawing fractures a part of your brain, so I could sit there and do a drawing as well as writing. And I think that the writing is natural to everybody here, right?
One more question back there.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. My question here is, Joyce, what really decided, what was the driving factor behind your decision to write a memoir, which is so intricately personal, as opposed to a fiction, which could possibly have been made as real without it, being that intricately personal?
Well, a person can write both. I felt that after my father died, which was in the year 2000, I felt that I could spend the whole rest of my writing life writing about losing a person, that I had this experience, the emotional experience of losing my father. It was really just the beginning of a sequence of losses, but that alone I wrote about it in essay form, and I did write about it in fiction. So I think both. The third person allows us a little bit of distance, but the first person is so intimate and sort of unmediated.
Megan, did you want to say something on that?
Oh, well, I guess I ended up writing poems and a memoir. I was a poet initially. I hadn't written a long nonfiction work. I couldn't write poems for maybe a similar reason that you're talking about the drawing. It was the aestheticization of the object was too primary for me, and I was still in this raw place of trauma. And so I think memoir had the through line of narrative, which I found very helpful. I think also, and perhaps this speaks to your question, there is this compulsion to remember. There is a compulsion to memorialize. There is a fear that everyone else is going to forget and that you are going to forget, as Jonathan so beautifully put it, right? And so for me, that was part of it. I think I was memorializing, I was thinking about my mother all the time, so why not write about her? But I wanted to honor her, so I didn't want to fictionalize or even write aestheticized poems.
No, I think that's, I would agree with that. And I didn't know that I would even write this book or publish this book, but there was never in my mind a thought that I would fictionalize it. It was hard enough writing like a true memoir, and I had guilt about writing that, but to fictionalize it, I mean, I've read people who have fictionalized it, and that's fine. I could never have done it. Just couldn't have done it.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Joyce. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Megan. I want to remind you all I want to remind you all that there are books for sale, and that the authors will be signing their books in the rotunda downstairs. So please, if you have other questions, go ask them. Thanks.
That went very fast.
Yeah, but it started about 15 minutes late, too.
Started
So.
late.
So all sort of short.
Yeah, 'cause I think you really only have 30 minutes to follow,
Yeah.
do the whole thing after introduction.